It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this evening. We have with us two giants in the field of public and social policy and a rising star in the field of education. The two giants are David Kirp and Sandy Jencks, and the rising star is Mehta. David Kirp is our main speaker. He's here to talk to us tonight about his most recent book, Improbable Scholars, which I understand is for sale outside. If you're interested, David made me say that, you'll know. He is the James P. Marver Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. This is something of a homecoming for him. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, and after graduating, he ran the Center for Law and Education at Harvard and was a professor here at the Ed School before moving to Berkeley. He has done pioneering work in the field of education law and policy and has been focused on a broad range of issues, including those pertaining to equity and opportunity, race and education, education reform generally, and pre-K. He is a prolific as well as award-winning author, having written 16 books, countless articles for academic and popular journals. I have to say, I am personally a huge fan and great admirer of his work. He combines a scholar's breadth and depth of knowledge with a journalist's eye for a good story and a novelist's turn of phrase. In a recent article in Slate, for example, he compared the rapid turnover of school leaders to the firing of NBA coaches, pointing out that in each context, a craving for instant gratification can often lead to poor decisions. His most recent book, Improbable Scholars, is classic David Kirp. It's about Union City, New Jersey, and the reforms that have gone on there and the success that they've experienced. It's a great story. It also is a story that, like many of David's other pieces of writing, questions the conventional wisdom that true reform can only happen outside of the traditional public school system. Our commentators are, as I mentioned, Sandy Jencks and Mehta. Sandy is the Malcolm Weiner Professor of Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also an alum of this school. His work focuses broadly on issues of economic inequality and social mobility, which naturally involves an examination of educational opportunity. I think it's fair to say that Sandy is one of the most influential and widely respected scholars of his or any other generation, and his seminal works, which include Inequality, the Urban Underclass, and the Black-White Achievement Gap, are classics in the field. Our rising star is Mehta, who is an associate professor here. His work focuses on the puzzle and challenge of creating high-quality schools at scale and the professionalization of teaching. His most recent book, The Allure of Order, which is terrific, argues that many of our education reforms are backwards in their approach, focused less on attracting and training talented teachers and more on handcuffing teachers to strict accountability regimes. He was recently ranked as the most influential junior scholar writing in the field of education. Here's how tonight's event will work. David will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then Sandy, Jal, and I will join him on stage. Sandy and Jal will give some brief comments, then I'll moderate a discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. For now, though, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
So it's a pleasure to be back to my old haunts. Thank you so much for being so hospitable with the weather. Makes me understand one reason why I decamped to California. And I want to thank Jim. Jim and I have a one-step removed relationship. Umpteen years ago with Mark Yudof, the recently retired president of the University of California system, wrote a book called Education Policy and the Law, and that book in its, how manyth edition, Jim? Manyth edition now has Jim as a co-editor. I've left the work in the hands of my youngers and betters. It's also a pleasure to be, at a place where my mentor, David Cohen, is back at teaching, and where Dick Elmore, from whose work I have learned more than I care to recount, is, and the place which has the most interesting publishing house in education that I know of. I mean, Harvard, I read so much what Harvard Education Press puts out, so it's a great institution. I don't have to tell you how contentious a moment this is in public education. It's the dominant rhetoric, and the reason for that provocative title. I was asked by the folks who put on these events, could I say something snappy, and I thought, is public education dead, counted as snappy? I won't keep you in suspense. As Jim said, the answer is no. But you wouldn't know that from a lot of national rhetoric in the subject. So I take as my text for the opening passage from a report prepared by Joel Klein and Condoleezza Rice. I never thought of Condoleezza Rice as a K-12 education expert, but never mind. The quote, "Educational failure puts the United States' future economic prosperity, global position, and physical safety at risk." So I was educated to read texts closely once upon a time, and I came upon the phrase physical safety. And I went, what the heck are they talking about? They're so sort of excited by the problem that they've sort of lost all grasp of anything tethered to reality. But it suggests something to you about the power of the animus, about the notion that the public school system is irretrievably broken. It is an odious bureaucracy. It is filled with time servers who basically are there to punch the clock and collect benefit checks and spend happy summers, lolling at the beach at taxpayers' expense, and bureaucrats who don't have an idea in their head, and kids who are entirely out of control. And the only solutions that people come up with are either a kind of Foucault discipline and punish approach to the teachers in the schools, basically look at and only at test scores. It's something called value added. Whole other conversation as to the serious statistical problems with that as a strategy. But teachers, if students did really well on math and reading tests, great. They get bonuses. If they didn't do really well, then they get put on notice and maybe fired. Failing schools get closed, and they're replaced by presumably better schools. Charter schools are meant to proliferate because they provide a healthy dose of competition in the system. And I noticed that when Arnie Duncan was here the other day, he really ducked the question about whether or not charter schools were the future of American education. And what's interesting about all of that is that it's rooted, all that critique is rooted in the model of the marketplace. And it's a model, it's a theory. And theories are worth testing out. The problem is that there's nothing in that theory for which there is any supportive data. So that charter schools, for example, overall do neither better nor worse than public schools. Massachusetts, at least, has been the model in terms of how to carefully choose and regulate charter schools and connect them with ordinary public schools. If you're in Arizona, if you are standing and breathing, you can get a charter. And when I looked at some of the charters, I thought maybe neither of those qualifications was necessary to have that job. As for vouchers, I commend you to the discussion in my book about the amazing voucher scheme that now exists in Louisiana. So if you want to see what the future could look like and how truly, literally scary it is, that's the place to go. But, as Mark Twain said about his own existence, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. I think that's a comment that one can make about public education. And so, as Jim said, the story that I tell focuses on one school district, Union City, New Jersey, which I came upon because it has a brilliant preschool program and then stuck around for a year to see how they had done as well as they have from preschool through grade 12. And after telling the story, I thought, well, although I think of myself as a writer, and I really appreciate Jim's introduction, these aren't New Yorker articles, and I do have a policy message, and so I wanted to look across the country at districts that also beat the demographic odds. And to get to the punchline first, they basically do the same kinds of old school things that Union City has done. They do them under the radar. These are not places that you know particularly well, but here's what makes Union City special, even in that context. So, from 3rd grade through high school, reading and math scores are at or above the New Jersey state average. New Jersey is like Massachusetts. Overall test scores would put it in the top 10 in the worldwide exam. So if you really were thinking about New Jersey as a country, we wouldn't be wringing our hands the way people do about the United States. I'm much less excited about test scores than I am about graduation rates, because I don't think anybody goes off to apply for a job and say, I was highly proficient in my 9th grade reading exam, hire me. More than 90% of the kids graduate, that's more than 10% higher than the national average, and something like 75% start college. Now, Union City is a really unlikely poster child for success. It is 3 miles from Times Square. If you take a bus from Port Authority, it's the first stop that you almost inevitably make. It is very poor by any metric that you care to measure. It is the most crowded city in America, and that is not because there are lots of tall buildings. It's because there are lots of 3-bedroom apartments, each bedroom occupied by a family with 2, 3, 4 kids in one room with a shelf in the refrigerator. It has the 2nd highest percentage of free and reduced price lunch kids in New Jersey. It would probably have the highest, except for the fact that an estimated 1/3 of the population is undocumented, and there are lots of parents who are afraid to stick their neck up and say, I want that federal program, worrying that that might lead to deportation. 75% of the students come from homes where Spanish is the home language, where it's the telenovela, right, and not the reality TV show, where it's football and not football that's on the TV screen. Nor was Union City always a remarkably good district. On the contrary, 25 years ago, things were so bad that the state was threatening to take over the district and run it. By the way, another strategy that has no evidence of success. And it was 2nd worst in the state. The only district that did worse than Union City was Camden. Now, some of you will know Camden, New Jersey. If those of you who don't can consider yourself fortunate. And so the rallying cry in Union City was, thank God for Camden. But that wasn't enough. That Union City was exemplified the all too familiar worst kind of education that immigrant kids get in this country. So by any metric, they are worse off. That's a nice tune, nice harp that's playing there in the background. They are less likely to go to preschool, they're more likely to get left back, they're more likely to be in special education, they're less likely to graduate, they're less likely to go to college than native-born kids are. And so that's what happens so often, is that we fail these kids. And why this is particularly disastrous is because they are the largest growing part of the population. They are a very important part of the face of America's future. So even thinking, self-interestedly, thinking about the economics of the next generation, this is the most short-sighted policy. The Union City story tells you that it's not an inevitable story. So I spent a year hanging out in Union City. I spent a lot of time in one 3rd grade classroom of kids who were learning English as they were prepping for that first big test. I was Mr. David to a bunch of kids, and it was a life-changing experience to be in a place where it wasn't Professor Kirp or Writer Kirp or any of the rest of it. It was, a guy who liked the kids and who the kids picked up was really attached to them. But I was all around the system. I mean, every place from hanging out with a mayor who I described as part Chicago Mayor Daley and part Mother Teresa in terms of character he was, with a superintendent sitting in whatever meetings I wanted to, going to classes across the system. Nobody was monitoring what it was that I did in that school system. And the bottom line message from Union City is pretty straightforward. There's no quick fix, no miracle cure. There are no charter schools there. There are no vouchers there. One of the parochial schools actually closed down because the parents decided that the public schools were doing a better job of educating their kids. It's very much old school strategies done right. Continuous improvement at the margins. So we tend to think about education as a sort of narrow, confined area. Don't spend much time looking outside at other institutions, because our bottom line is this kind of woozy notion of school success. But I wanted to see what successful businesses did, because their bottom line is money. So I found Edward Deming. Edward Deming, for those of you who don't know him, is a fellow who was basically shunned by American businesses in the 70s, goes to Japan, is regarded as the architect of the Japanese miracle, comes back and becomes lionized in this country. And the message is very simple. It's a message of continuous improvement. Learn from the people in the field. It's also, for those of you who know about preschool programs, the high scope curriculum, just plan, kids sit around the table, plan what they're going to do, go do it, and then they get together and review and figure out what they've learned and go on. Plan, do, review, continuous improvement. It's all really the same model. And then I happened upon an interview last year in the New York Times with Reed Hastings. He's the CEO of Netflix. Now, you may remember the Netflix debacle of a couple of years ago, where Netflix split into, this is the DVDs, these are the online, we're going to charge you separately, we're going to charge you a lot more. Everybody fled. It was almost as much of a fiasco as New Coke. And they came back. And so the interview wanted to know, what did you do? And here's Reed Hastings. Plenty of people were urging me to take drastic steps to show the company was regaining momentum. There was amazing pressure to come up with a shiny object that would make everything better. But the phrase I used was, there are no shortcuts. We weren't going to find an idea or gesture that would make people love us again overnight. We had to earn their trust by being very steady and disciplined. I couldn't say for sure whether we'd recover, but I was confident that our best odds were to be very steady and focus on improving the service. So, being very steady and focusing on improving the service put Reed Hastings into Union City, and he'd feel right at home. Because what they have done, what Union City has done, is to rely on a sequence of proven game-changing strategies. There's nothing fancy that goes on there. Any educator with a pulse knows what's happening, knows the strategies that are being used in Union City. And it starts, with a place that Dick Elmore starts. The sort of essence of the project of education is to bring together a talented teacher, a challenging curriculum, and an engaged student. And if you think about what it takes to get there, I mean, everything from collaboration among teachers, parent engagement, a system of high expectations and respect, it's all baked into that very deceptively simple formula. And the job of public education is to build a system of supports that can make that happen. So what did Union City do? And I hesitate to produce a list because people come to me and they say, look, I've dog-eared this book and here are my 2 favorite passages, which are the sort of, here are the list of things that folks did. And what makes me nervous about that is they sound like, Chinese fortune cookie items. And if you sort of say them as one-liners, they don't mean much. And so you really do need to see them in context. So with that, as a kind of disclaimer, let me talk about what they did. For starters, Union City is one of the so-called Abbott districts in New Jersey, one of the poor urban school districts that, because of a court order, has received funding from the state to provide high-quality preschool education for 3- and 4-year-olds, full-day preschool education. Now, quality is one of those terms, and people just this phrase just comes trippingly off the tongue, high-quality preschool. It means many different things. It's very hard to achieve. It has a lot less to do, I would argue, with the degrees that people bring in with them than the quality of the engagement between students and between children and teachers. The teacher is aid to kids' exploration and not the teacher carrying on circle time because she's afraid of losing the attention of her kids. By the way, those of you who've not been in a preschool class recently, if you're feeling blue on a day, go find a good preschool class in the morning, because kids are at their best in the morning, and go watch. It's the best teaching. So here's a little secret. There's an inverse relationship between how much teachers are paid and the prestige they have and the quality of teaching. I hope I'm not going to demonstrate that phenomenon here. So Union City, by the way, didn't take a, it's not all public school provided classes. The public school preschool is one of the very best I've seen in the country. And when I went to Union City, when I'm talking about this place, in my head is my policy yardstick. It's the policy version of the golden rule. And the question I'm always asking is, how would I feel about sending a child that I loved into this environment? Would this be good enough for a child that I cared about? And across the board, Union City matched that standard. Not only is there a great public school there are a system of 35 private providers, once upon a time daycare centers, that now have trained teachers and with an incredible amount of mentoring and coaching from the public school folks, are remarkably good. And in many cases, you'd have no idea if you were in the classroom, whether you were in a public school class or the former Bida-Wee nursery school or the preschool in the basement of St. Ignatius Church. That's in itself a remarkable management and educational accomplishment. Union City realized early on, they turned to somebody in the system faced with the threat of takeover. They turned to somebody who was a middle-level bureaucrat in the system who happened to know two things really well. He knew about bilingual education and he knew about language acquisition. Because they realized two things. One, you have children are going to learn English a whole lot better if they are thoroughly grounded in their home language. If they're not, the research suggests, then they're always a little bit at sea, and the data suggests it takes them longer to master English, and they don't do as good a job at mastering English. And, regrettably, both you and I inhabit states that have prohibited bilingual education. That seems to be a case of ideology triumphing over pedagogy. A very finely granulated program. And throughout what Union City does, it really treats its kids as individuals. It's in effect, they have an individual educational program, an IEP for every child. They don't call it that, but that's how they think about what it is they're doing. In terms of bilingual education, kids are grouped within a classroom in terms of where they are in language acquisition, where they are in terms of mastery of materials. So the groups switch a lot, and the teachers in classrooms where there are Spanish and English-speaking kids have this incredibly complicated job of pirouetting among groups that are different both in terms of skill level and language ability. So you might have a class of 20 students, but you really have 4 preps for every subject. That's hard to manage. We'll talk a bit about how they get there. The other thing that was foundational to the change was the fact that these are children who come from families, many of them barely literate with a 2nd or 3rd grade education, many of them from poor rural communities in Ecuador or Guatemala or the Dominican Republic. 30, 40 years ago, they came from Cuba. Very different group of kids, the children of professionals by and large. These kids are increasingly poor. If they come at high school with a diploma that says this child had an 8th grade education, it's more likely the case that that was a piece of paper that was purchased from a headmaster for $25 or $50. They, in fact, know so little that they couldn't find their own country on a map. So for the young kids, bilingual education, the young kids get this granulated program, and they disappear into the regular school system by 4th or 5th grade. For the youngsters who come as 14 and 15-year-olds, the school system has 4 years to teach these kids Spanish, to become literate in Spanish, to become fluent in English, to master all of that subject material, and to learn America, because this is one of the things they have to learn is that weather like this is not common in the Dominican Republic, right? So how do they do with those youngsters? Half of those kids who come in as teenagers graduate from high school. And just to give you a comparison, half does not sound great, and they're not happy with half. But the graduation rate of the public schools of Buffalo, New York, the graduation rate of schools in Cleveland, Ohio, is lower than the graduation rate for these kids who've come in at this point in their lives. And 3 of the top 20 graduates from last year were students who'd come 5 years earlier speaking no English. And those kids, another part of the story is they focused, at each level, they figured out strategies that would work for kids who would, excuse me, different levels of ability, and have puzzled out ways of finding the kinds of supports that will allow kids to progress, whether in 3rd grade, through reading and math games and English, or 10th and 11th grade, to learn subject matter in Spanish while they're learning English along the way. So too in terms of language and literature. These families tend not to speak a lot to their kids. They're busy. They got a lot of other stuff to do. And they don't know a lot of language. Some of you are going to be familiar with that classic study of professional kids, middle-class kids, welfare family kids. By age 4, these obsessive-compulsive researchers actually counted the number of words that these children heard. The kids from the professional families had heard 32 million more words than the kids from the welfare families, and the vocabulary of those 4-year-olds from professional families was bigger than the vocabulary of the welfare parents. So that's old news. The new news is you can detect the same process as early as 18 months, and you can detect an acceleration of this process by 24 months. That's work that was published this past year out of Stanford. And so if you go into the schools, it is a word-drenched environment. They're being read stories, they're talking, they're being asked questions, they're writing a lot, they're writing across curriculum, they're combining art and writing, they're combining science and writing. They're doing whatever they can to get kids out of the mad, bad, sad, glad vocabulary and into a much richer sense of what language is like. The system doesn't wait until the year after students have left to report to teachers how their kids did on the state exams. There are a couple of assessments during the course of the year. Union City can analyze those every which way, and they do so, but they don't do it in order to punish teachers. They do it in order to help teachers with problems they're having and kids with problems they're having. So it turns out, for example, that youngsters have a much harder time understanding nonfiction passages than fiction passages. So there will be an emphasis on developing that set of skills. They have a much harder time with word problems in math than they do with computational problems in math. So the same thing holds true. And the teachers work together. So I'm going to say something now that's probably going to get me kicked out of this building, but never mind. When I asked the teachers how they had learned their craft, not a single one of them mentioned their college or graduate school education. Not one. So the only invitation that I've turned down is an invitation from the deans of colleges of education, because I thought this would not be a particularly productive exchange. But there's a message in there about the relationship between the acquisition of the craft and the pedagogy that goes on in many education schools that are training teachers. That relates to that whole question of quality we were talking about before. These teachers are homebodies. So you look at the teachers in Boston. People come to Boston from all over the place, but that is not America. If you go, not so far away, you go to Springfield, or you go to Albany, or you go to Scranton, or you go to Greenville, South Carolina, or it doesn't matter, you're going to find that the teachers are homebodies. They were born, grew up, went to school, developed families, settled down, and taught within an hour or 2 hours of where they started out. That's it. That's American teachers. And all the Teach for America teachers are not going to change that fact. So the important virtue of this is that when these teachers talked about their kids, it was not a metaphoric concept. It really was their kids, the kids from their community who were there. And I've got to say that one of my bits of learning was that I went into this as the kind of classic snob who believes that, you know, teachers who come from fourth-rate, fifth-rate colleges are going to do a disservice to students. And all you had to do was walk into the classroom of a guy who had dropped out of Jersey City College because he couldn't stand it, spent 10 years working in the post office, schlepping bags, bought a truck, delivered packages, came back, decided he really wanted to combine art and teaching, and is now teaching science and math in 8th grade special needs class, and is one of the best teachers that I've ever seen. So that was a really instructive lesson to me. How did teachers learn? They learn from each other. You know, teachers work together collaboratively. Weak teachers, teachers who said, I don't know how to teach writing, would turn to somebody in the school who did a better job of this and say, could you help? And that teacher would come into the class and do a few lessons and co-teach a few lessons and then observe a few lessons. When they brought in professional development folks, they brought them in. They didn't send teachers off to some conference where a guru with the newest bright and shiny strategy stood up and, you know, gave her talk, and then the teachers went back and did something or other with it. That's in the trade, that's called spray and pray. They actually bring the people who are providing the support for teachers into the classroom where that help is going to be most useful. The schools reach out to parents. They've got parent liaisons who actually are of the community, who know the parents, who understand what their needs are, not just in terms of their kids' education, but also, I can't afford to buy a winter coat is the kind of question a parent would feel comfortable asking, or can you help me get on the waiting list for the public housing project in town? So people said there's a lot of parent participation, and I was very skeptical because urban school districts have a hard time attracting parents. So 4 weeks into the term, first parent night, George Washington Elementary School where I was hanging out, it was so rainy that an umbrella was useless. It would get crushed immediately. And I think there's going to be nobody here. About an estimated 90% of the kids had some parent there, somebody who was engaged with this kid, a parent, a tia, an abuela, somebody. And they loved the principal who stood up, very warm woman. They absolutely went bonkers for the person who's the parent liaison. I mean, she'd earned it, clearly, in terms of what it was that she was doing. Finally, this is a system. Many school districts are systems of schools. That is, they're independent schools, each of them going their own way. So that, for example, in Newark brings in a superintendent who's a protege of Joel Klein, and she says, my secret is I'm going to hire star principals, and I'm going to let them, you know, run their show, and they'll be responsible for the results. Well, you'll see how that turns out not well for a whole bunch of reasons, but importantly, even if those people really are stars and can inspire their teachers, poor children move a lot. So they change schools a lot. So even if you have a kid at brilliant school A, if she moves to brilliant school B that is totally different, she is at C. The teachers develop the curriculum based on what's been shown to work. But they put it together in ways that are rooted both in the evidence and rooted in their sense of what's going to work in Union City. And because the teachers are doing this, and it's not some off-the-shelf curriculum, and it's not McGraw-Hill coming in and saying this is what you should do, there's a whole lot more buy-in to what goes on. Finally, there is a culture in this school system. Expectations are high across the board. In the high school, the hardest part of an education system to reform, always. The teachers, because of really a change in the atmospherics and a change in the leadership of that school, have shifted from these kids are doing good enough, this is a good enough school, to we want this to be a good school. And the measure of that is, remember the population we're talking about, every child is now taking the SAT the preliminary SAT in their junior year. They're not all expected to pass it. They're not all expected to go to college, but this suggests what the expectations look like. It's also a very, very warm place. I talk in the book about a culture of respeto and a culture of abraces. Abraces, warmth, embraces, literally. You can feel it. You walk into a school and you can tell whether it's a warm, loving place or a penal colony. You can figure that out very quickly. And my favorite sort of anecdote about that came one day when I was watching an 8th grade math teacher. She was a nice middle-aged woman, not particularly charismatic. She had her back to the class. She was putting some stuff on the board. At least for me, the kind of math-phobic one, not particularly charismatic either. And the kids are just totally attending. By the way, I never saw the kind of disruptive, unruly behavior that exists in so many places. But these kids were really into it. And so after class, I said to her, how do you explain this? And she said, let me tell you a story. Last week, a boy from another district moved in and was assigned to my class. And when I was writing on the board, he was making fun of me to some of the other kids in the class. And they told him, basically, to shut up. And after class, this group of students went up to her and said, Miss Jones, don't worry, we have your back. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not what you expect 14-year-olds to be saying to their okay, not favorite teacher. That's the system. That's the way people respond. Finally, I feel like Columbo here. This is a system that's a work in progress. The learning never ends. This is what continuous improvement means. You can't not be paying attention at any point. You've got to be watching what's going on, looking for ways of doing things that are better, catching problems when they arise. And that is the Union City story. Easy to say, really hard to do. Then when I finished the book, I looked at all the kind of data sets that I could find. There were case studies, there were surveys, there were analyses, regression analyses, trying to look for characteristics of districts that in Texas that performed brilliantly in math despite who the population was and their expected level of performance. So I was looking at districts that by test metrics were doing better than you'd expect from the nature of the students who were there. And it's not as though they were all identical. So I looked at districts that were rich. Union City is rich. By the way, you guys are rich too, just in case you don't know this. Come to California, we spend half as much as you do. They were rich and they were poor. Aldine, Texas, a place maybe 2 people in this audience have heard of, and they probably read the book. Houston's poor cousin, more students than Washington, D.C., more students than Boston, $7,800 per kid. You go to the superintendent's office, you want a cup of coffee, you put a quarter in the jar. You go to Montgomery County, 1/3 very rich and educated, 1/3 poor and immigrant. You go to a little farm town, Sanger, California, you look at places that are unionized, not unionized, elected school boards, appointed school boards, any metric that I could find. Because I knew people would say, that's a lovely story, but. And I did not know what I would find. A little scared, actually, to do it this way. And what I found was that while there are lots of differences in the particulars, and while the money makes a huge difference, the trade-offs that Aldine, Texas has to make are immoral for the kids who are going there. But the structure of support, what they are trying to do, very much the same across these places. So there's one non-negotiable. Oh, by the way, I should add, I spent yesterday at Somerville talking to the folks in Somerville, because they had read the book and they said, this is Somerville. And in a lot of ways, it is Somerville, and nobody, outside this area would have any idea that Somerville was a place that was, really doing good stuff and worth paying attention to. There are lots of Somervilles around the country. But the one thing that the successful districts all have is stability of leadership. All places that, at some point, realize that the kind of turnover, the churn that goes on in so many districts is absolutely fatal to success. Because the classic model in America in an urban school district is the board disappointed with the performance of the existing superintendent, fires her, goes looking for, you know, the miracle worker, and a miracle worker raises his hand and says, I can do it, comes to the job, lo and behold, you know, it's 2.5 years have gone by, you know, no miracle has happened, the board says, out with the bums, let's find a new miracle worker. The average urban school superintendent is on the job for less than 3 years, and I don't care if you're a MacArthur Genius Award winner, you are not going to be able to remake, to reform an organization as complicated as an urban school system in that time. So the challenge, the ultimate challenge, it seems to me, is if that's what we continue doing, we're going to repeat the cycle that we're in now. And it would really be nice if people got the message that Aesop is sometimes got it right, that sometimes the tortoise really does beat the hare. So thank you very much.
David, you want to
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
You can sit wherever you like.
Go ahead. Thanks.
Which one of you would like to go first? All right. So now we'll hear from Jal first and then Sandy.
Okay. First off, thanks for coming. Thanks for braving the weather. Thanks, David, for writing such a fabulous book. Jim said this in the introduction, but it's worth considering. You know, how many ed policy books have you heard described as novelistic? You know, I have a whole library full of ed policy books, and I see very few, if any, on the shelves that could be described as novelistic. If anyone's read Random Family, it's a little like that, except much more uplifting. So it is a captivating book, and it has a really important message, which you heard David say today. All of the things that David emphasized, the importance of the instructional triangle, stable leadership, continuous improvement, early childhood education, and the idea that education isn't going to be improved by the latest fad, but by applied effort, skill, and intelligence of the teachers and administrators working in schools in a district is very true and very under-recognized in the policy debate. I hope that some of those points are familiar to some of our students here, because these are the kinds of things that we talk a lot about here, and the case studies that David mentioned of Sanger or Aldine or Long Beach or Montgomery County do share similar characteristics. So it's not so much that it's sort of a radically different story, but sometimes you don't need a radically different story. Sometimes the story just needs to be true, and this story is true. So in all of those ways, I really would encourage you to read the book if you haven't read it. Since we're supposed to be discussants, though, I thought I would raise 4 points. The first has to do with deeper learning. I've been doing a study on deeper learning in high schools, and there are pockets of classrooms and schools which challenge kids to really think, that work in the top half of Bloom's taxonomy, asking kids to analyze, synthesize, and create as opposed to recall, understand, and apply. But for the most part, my tour of highly recommended American schools has not resulted in a lot of schools that I felt like with confidence I could send either of my sons if I wanted them to have a really rigorous education. So there is a lot of national data which suggests that this gets harder as kids get older, that elementary schools tend to be have more emphasis on exploration, play, critical thinking than do schools which serve older students. I very much second David's point that if you really want to see kids working in a sort of self-monitored, engaging, playful way, that go check out some good 3- and 4-year-olds. You will find a lot of that. So in part, the difference in what I'm seeing and what David's seeing may be that a lot of his observations draw on elementary schools. But the best schools we saw in New Jersey, the best public schools, basically said that the state tests were kind of far too easy, their kids could pass them easily, and that they needed much more difficult benchmarks if they thought that their kids were really going to achieve a rigorous education. So I'm not saying that David didn't see deeper learning. He was there, I wasn't. I might say that the fact that the sort of standard metric we use to judge these things doesn't entail agreement between the two of us is worrying, that there should be some kind of metric that we could both use and that we would both agree upon that would measure whether or not that's what we're seeing. That's the first point. The second point has to do with public and charter schools. At least the way that David's work was shaped for the New York Times, and as anyone who's ever published in the Times will know, 1,000 more people will read anything that's published in the Times than everything that you've laboriously put down on 300 pages over 5 years. The 1,000 words you write in the Times are what people will know. So I think that's important. And the way that it was portrayed in David's piece in the Times when the book came out was essentially, America has gone down this path of charter schools, and really, we shouldn't be headed down that path, and public schools are or should be the answer. And I don't know to the degree that that is really the way that David sees it. But I guess I would be tempted to take a more kind of agnostic position, to say that the kinds of things that David saw in the schools that he saw, schools that were word-drenched, that emphasized continuous improvement, where teachers learned from one another, that tried to support kids early in their trajectories. Those are all the same things that good charter schools are trying to do as well. And so from my perspective, the question is less sort of charter versus not than sort of good school versus bad, and how we could produce more good schools. The third point has to do with bureaucracy. Again, I don't doubt what David saw in Union City, but I do think that there is a huge mountain of evidence and experience which would say that many, many districts out there do function as sort of top-down compliance-oriented entities, which are very much mistrusted by schools and are mistrustful of the schools of which they oversee, and that dynamic is very harmful. So that's not to say that districts or provinces, in the case of Ontario and places in Canada, can't be constructive actors. I think that's one thing that really sort of studying this and looking at these sort of case study exceptions teaches you, that you've been out in the world, you've only seen the district as sort of the people who come in and look at your bulletin boards and ask why you aren't, why your objectives aren't listed, and you're like, that really has nothing to do with whether or not I'm having a good day with teaching. If that's your experience with districts, which it has been for a number of my students, the fact that there are places like Union City and the other ones listed out there is really heartening. It sort of shows that there could be a different relationship between the people who work in the school and the people who work outside of the school. But I don't think we could sort of conclude from the basis of what are a relatively small number of districts in America that there isn't sort of something fundamentally broken in the way in which districts and schools usually relate to each other. Which brings me to my last point, which is about solutions. So there are 15,000 districts and 100,000 schools in America. And as David says, the average tenure of a superintendent in one of those districts is 3 years. So we could try to work towards a state of affairs where each of those 15,000 districts was practicing a kind of form of continuous improvement and doing all the wonderful things that David describes in the book. But there, as David says, the sort of Chinese fortune cookie point, it's very difficult to bring together the elements in a way that really creates a good culture. And there are a number of external dynamics, including school boards, civil service administrators who've been there for a long time and sort of only know a kind of siloed compliance mentality, and a list of others which you know, which have made it such that only in cases where there's really inspired and ongoing leadership and stable political conditions, those are the places that we sort of hold up as our sort of success cases. And so I've argued that if we really wanted to see success at scale, some form of professionalization, so David mentioned sort of markets versus states, the third part of that triangle are professions. If you really wanted to see sort of quality at scale across these 15,000 districts and 100,000 schools, you might want some mechanisms by which we consistently trained people, had them meet a standard, gave them some time to work with each other once they'd met those standards. And that would look more like medicine, engineering, accounting, et cetera, than it would look like the way in which we do school teaching today. And that might generate more consistency across. Like I'll give an example. I moved to a new town. I needed a dentist. I picked one out of the yellow pages, and I went there. And then I got there, and I had some confidence that there was a sort of set of procedures that would be applied to my teeth, even though I'd never met these people, and they may not have finished at the top of their dental class. Because the field has certain kind of established ways in which you treat teeth, and thus I had some confidence that such a thing would exist at this local dentist, and thus far I have not been led astray. And I would not say going across schools in America that right now we have that kind of assurance. There are great schools out there, there are less great schools out there are great teachers out there, and there are less skilled teachers out there, just right down the hall from one another. And so I guess I would take a stance less like we've put too much emphasis on these reformers, and if we just went with the publics, we would be okay. I guess I'm at my core a sort of rooted progressive where sort of the best day is not yesterday but tomorrow. And thus we should be thinking about how could we create a better system. A better system would have assessments that weren't multiple choice, sensible use of technology, more time for teachers to work together, support of children before they enter school and after school, and so on and so forth. So I guess I see a sort of multi-dimensional policy agenda on each of which there is a sort of forward-looking step that we can take.
Thanks, Sandy.
I think I should start off by saying I agree with practically everything that everybody has said, even though much of it was contradictory.
Internally or between us?
No, probably internally too if we looked really carefully, but I was thinking about somewhat more about between us. But I think I should also start with a confession. My experience of teaching public schools was extremely limited. I got out of the Harvard Graduate School of Education with no training whatever to teach, which was based on the fact that the people I had talked to said being trained to teach was not useful. But I was eager to dodge the draft, and I went here anyway.
That's quite an endorsement.
It was a good year, but I did not learn anything much about how to teach. And then I went out and I decided that I had no idea what to do with my life, so maybe if I had a job, but it was not only part-time. I was writing about a San Francisco State College at the time. I thought, well, I might as well get some kind of certification to do something which will bring in a living. So I got myself in as a teacher in training at Galileo High School in San Francisco. The great virtue of Galileo High School was it was just up the street from a chocolate factory. The chocolate factory is still there, and the whole place smelled just fabulous all the time. But I don't think I've learned a great deal about the insides of public schools since then. I spent some time as a journalist writing about education, but I don't want to try to either agree with Chal or with David about exactly what's the right way to do this. I want to talk a little bit about politics instead. If the question is public education dead, which is only one of the questions I think we are talking about, I think it's the wrong question. But I think it's something we need to worry about. I think the question that David is interested in is, how do you make a school better? And I don't see that there's any particular relationship between that question and the question of whether you do it in a charter school or a public school or a private school or whatever. I went to a dreadful private school for a while. I went to a fabulous private school after that for a while. I went back and taught in an in-between public school. The correlations of these things seem to be weak, and I think the point that's been made already, I think, by everyone is when you look at the charter schools and the public schools, it's very hard to see much evidence that one group is better or worse than the other. There's some good ones and some bad ones, and a lot in between in both sets. The reason everybody is worked up about this, I think, is that the charter schools have become the crusade of the right. And I have to confess that when I was writing about education in the late 1960s, I was banging the drum for school choice. And I still think there's a lot to be said for school choice. But the company I keep was somewhat different, and so I'm embarrassed now to confess to this penchant for choice. But although choice is, I think, a good thing, it's not a solution to anything. It's like saying you can go and buy whatever kind of toothpaste you want. Well, that doesn't tell you whether it's going to be good toothpaste. It just tells you you've got a lot of different stuff on the shelf. So I think the point I really want to stress here is that whether public schools survive and whether the public system survives depends on politics and not on the performance of schools. That the people who believe in private schools and the people who believe in public schools are different kinds of people. And which group will win out in the end is not at all dependent on whether they figure out the best way to teach math. The differences aren't going to be that great, and if they were great, they still wouldn't matter that much. Most people are not moved by numbers, and in the United States, politics is driven, especially around education, by one fundamental fact, which is just really important to remember, which is most people are not paying attention. And if most people are not paying attention, the way they get mobilized for something is not by evidence, it's not by data, it's certainly not by charts and regression coefficients and things like that. Nobody sits still for that stuff. Even my editors won't sit still for that stuff, much less, you know, the reader, poor reader. So it's mostly based on emotions and symbols and all kinds of things like that. And what's been going on lately is mostly a fight between a sort of, it's a war, if you will, between negative emotions and positive emotions. And some people like the negative ones, and some they like to get really angry. And other people like the positive ones and want everybody to be lovey-dovey. And I think most of the people in this room, including me, prefer the second group to the first. But it's not the formulation of what's the difference between charter schools and public schools is not helped by thinking that this kind of conflict about individualism versus community and all that is what's at stake here. I think my bottom line is this. I think the survival of the public schools depends almost entirely on their having an alternative vision to the one that the critics of public schools have, not on whether they can figure out a way to get more kids to be proficient in mathematics or reduce the high school dropout rate. I don't see any evidence that we can get the public schools to do that better than charter schools, and I don't see much of any evidence that the charter schools can do it better than public schools. It's hard to do, period, full stop. So what's going to make the difference? Why do I even care which system survives, or do I care whether it's a mixed system? Well, I think the reason I care is, and the reason I think I'm worried is, that I don't think the public education system at the moment has a vision that it's projecting to anybody as to what's good about this. It used to be that the public school system was promoted on the grounds that it was all about all the things we had in common, or if we didn't have them in common, we should have them in common. And we were going to make this a system which would bring us together in some way, which would be part of the melting pot and all of that. And that was still hanging around as a kind of, as an almost literal hangover when I was in school. It was done. The immigrants had been shut out and all of that, but there were lots of people who were born in other countries who were still here, and we were still going through that. But when that went away, we kind of lost it for what was important about public schools. And for my money, at least, the thing that's important is that it's about doing something collectively. It's about something that requires collaboration. It's about making us feel more responsible for one another. It's about some vision of a common shared society. And it's not going to be promoted by people whose ideas destroy the enemy, which seems to be the vision of the advocates of the charter schools, although not, by and large, the vision of the people who run the charter schools, who are not, I think, any more caught up in this than... I'm going to back off on this. There may be some difference in the distribution, say, of the attitudes of teachers on these kinds of things, but certainly I have not seen any evidence that has convinced me that there are more punitive people in charter schools than in public schools, or that there are more collaborative people in public schools than in private schools. But whatever the evidence is about the reality, what's needed here is some overarching vision as to what we're trying to do. And that's what I think is missing. So that's what I'm worried about.
Great, Sandy, thank you, and thank you, Jal. David, I'll pose the first question to you, which is, do you have any reaction?
Well, I disagree with Sandy on one point, and that is I think Jal and I are in a pretty basic agreement. For one thing, remember I said at the beginning of this talk that it's always hard to take a 200 and some odd page book and condense it, and so a lot of what Jal is saying is consistent with things that I say in the book. There may be differences in emphasis. And as John knows well, you got 1,250 words in the New York Times, and I can't tell you the kind of shaving that went on to get to those 1,250 words. And the argument about that first paragraph that you're talking about how you excite readers versus how do you inform readers. But the book is a lot more, I think, it's a lot more nuanced than this. It's great to be in the company of smart, engaged folks here, because it always, it forces you to think. I'm intrigued that the conversation has gone down the charter school, public school route. All I would say about that, and I say this in the book, there are great charter schools. There are not so great charter schools. We do not, the best charter school system that I know of, which is very much a work in progress, are the KIPP schools. And the KIPP schools, by the way, have a horrible college persistence rate because they've belatedly figured out that they're so good at getting kids to follow directions that when they're on their own, they don't know what to do. And they're actually, to their credit, that's now where they are focused, on old-fashioned notions like character. But there are 120 KIPP schools in the country. That is a fraction of a percent of the schools. We've got 60+ million kids to educate. So I don't think, at the end of the day, I don't think this is really a choice. We're not going to educate those kids in one school by one school by one school. This is why I wrote about a system, a district, and not a school. There's too many, when you've got, how many schools in the country, Joe?
100,000.
100,000 schools. You're not going to, the other thing I would, anybody who thinks that there's going to be a tidy answer to this, confuses the United States with France. We don't function like that. Anything we do is going to be imperfect, provisional, and evolving along the way. But absolutely, in many, many schools, the bureaucracy is a top-down, fear-driven organization. That's one of the things that makes this an interesting place, and I talk a fair amount about the bureaucracy. In terms of deeper learning, there's a chapter in the book about the high school, and I think what's happened in the high school is indeed it has been moving pretty rapidly away from the kind of skill and drill prep for the tests to the kinds of problem-driven stuff. The science program is astonishing. I mean, they win national science fairs. You don't do that by teaching to the test. They've had several Gates Millennium Scholars. They have kids all through the Ivy Leagues who are doing really well. And that's, by the way, down to one incredible 80-year-old teacher who was a refugee from King Farouk's Egypt. That's a long time ago. Who just refuses to believe that these kids can't do what any other kids can do, and lo and behold, they do. But there are some amazing teachers in English and social studies that I saw. I mean, I totally agree with Jal that it's tougher there, but it's certainly happening. Again, this is a story about an aspiration. And the question is, for me, the question is, can other school districts learn from this place and do better? Will they? Because there really is, as Sandy suggests, there really is a hunger for a vision out there. And there's a hunger for something positive in this story. That piece in the Times was the most widely emailed piece in the paper when it came out. That was the day that the Pope resigned. So my favorite email came from my godson who said, "You beat the Pope." I will treasure that forever. But it really suggests something less about the piece and more about the desire to move in the direction that Sandy is talking about. So let me just, I think what has gone on in terms of the exchange so far is that it's enriched the conversation, and I hope that carries on happening. I'm sure it will.
We'll see with this next question.
I'm on the optimist side of Sandy's divide. So live in hope.
So one of the things that strikes me about the book and your talk is the emphasis on the lack of pizzazz and the adherence to what you call old school methods. It's just sort of hard work, sticking with continuous improvement. And the question I had was, well, why don't we see more of these districts then? If there is no real magic, what's preventing other districts? Because I think you would be the first to recognize that even though there are other places like Montgomery County or Aldine or Sanger that are similar in terms of their success, at least by some measures, they're the exception, right? These are the public schools that beat the odds, just like there are charter schools that beat the odds. And so my puzzlement in reading the book is, why don't we see this all over the place? And what has Union City figured out that other places haven't figured out?
Well, I think, and you're absolutely right, there are more of these places than we know because they don't get attention. There's no Michelle Reed with the broom sweeping out the bad teachers. This is all very under the radar, but still the rarity.
Right.
And I think the start of it is the impatience, is the impatience factor. A school district is not doing well by some measure. It brings in somebody and it doesn't say, we're going to give you X number of years and here are the benchmarks that we want you to meet that we'll agree on. And then we'll give you more and more sort of latitude given how well you've done. That's the story in every one of the districts that I described. They all had their bottomed out moments. And in Sanger, for example, as you know, the relations between teachers and the school district were so bad that there was a billboard on the outskirts of this little farm town outside of Fresno that said, basically, prospective teachers, drive through. This is a terrible place for you. Do not think about teaching in Sanger. That tells you something about how the depth of the animus. You go there now, it's a very, very different world. But it wasn't a different world in a year or 2 years or 3 years. This is part of the building of trust that the sort of discussion of what's going on in Ontario describes. So that's one factor. The politics is relevant to this factor. People run for school board as a first job in politics. It's a stepping stone to something else. They want a victory. They want to be able to say, look, I accomplished X, Y, and Z. They want quick results along the way. So a school system where the line folks, the teachers, and the principals know that there's going to be this turnover, the silliest thing for them to do is to respond from the new set of directions because they're going to be sort of shifting back and forth in the wind. And then there's a kind of Pied Piper of Hamelin syndrome. There being no technology of education, people grasp for the shiny new object. This new program, this new whatever, this piece of technology. Union City makes good use of technology, but technology is not the answer. If the computer had never been invented, I'd be talking about Union City in this context. But people think, okay, they come to a place like Union City, and lots of folks do. It's kind of a Lourdes, right, for the education pilgrims. They say, I want to do the way you do management, or I want to do the kind of assessment you do, or I want to do preschool, as if you can just pluck one of these things out and not think about system building as a part of the story. And I think that the point that Jal made, which is central to his work and insufficiently attended to in mine, has to do with professionalization. He talks about dentists. I think about plumbers and electricians. You know, you call up, you go to the yellow pages and you call up a plumber and electrician, you know that you're going to get somebody of some competence. And besides, if you don't like that approach, you do what I do and you go to Yelp and you see what other users have said about the plumber and electrician. We don't have a Yelp, really, for schools that's a reliable thing to do, and we don't have a consistent way of teaching folks. This is a huge problem. I would argue it has less to do at the outset with who goes into the profession than how they are trained and what it is that they learn. It would be great to have people who were themselves much more prone to the kind of deep thinking that Jal is talking about. But I do think, you know, there is the unpublicly told scandal story of the state of teacher education in this country. And that's also part of what this tale is about. And you have bureaucrats who grow up in a big system, and you know, they behave the way their predecessors behaved, which is often this top-down, fear-driven, you know, don't respond. You know, somebody is going to be in office for a short period of time. She thinks, I've got to use command and control because I don't have any other levers that I can think of. So all of which is to say, it's a very rich, complicated story, and the politics that Sandy talks about is very much a part of it. This is all inside baseball stuff. And there's that larger question as to what do these institutions stand for? What do we want American kids to learn? And for a whole variety of reasons, a different discussion entirely, we're fixated on reading and math test performance and graduation rates. That's the fixation. But without knowing what that means, what it means to pass the high school graduation test, without having a sense of what that prepares people for, without having a sense of what we want people to be prepared for, without that conversation going on, with yelling and screaming being the norm in this context. You know, you've got Michelle Rhee on one side of the conversation and Diane Ravitch on the other, both of whom I'm quite sure care about kids, but neither of whom is contributing to an outcome that's going to measurably advance the state of public education.
I'd invite members of the audience who have questions to start lining up at the microphone. The hour is running late, so I'll just pose one more, and then we'll open it up. I wonder if the three of you might talk about out-of-school factors. They play some role in the book, but when you talk about the fact that the parents are showing up to the back-to-school night and the like, but I wonder what you thought after spending a year in Union City about the ability of schools to negate the effects of poverty and the importance of out-of-school factors versus in-school factors, which, as you know, is a perennial debate.
Well, the book that I wrote before this, which is called Kids First, says we spend so much time looking at the 8 to 3 day. We don't think about the kid and the rest of kids' lives. So, and we certainly don't spend enough time focused on community schools. That is, schools that really do think about sunrise, sunset, health, sports, science, history, all the stuff that's been driven out, all the things that we would, again, want for our own kids as part of what a system looks like. And that vision is out there. Again, to me, and it's a variant of what Sandy is saying, changing the conversation from our schools are failing because not enough kids are reading at the proficiency level at 3rd grade. An important fact, but not the only fact. Broadening the conversation, it seems to me, is crucial if we're going to get anywhere in addressing that set of bigger questions about school and society.
Just a brief thought on that point. I mean, I think I think it's unfortunate the way that it has gotten portrayed in the sort of political debate, that a sort of group of people emerged as kind of no excuses school reformers and sort of argued that you couldn't be for school reform if you thought that out of school factors mattered, when everybody knows there's, you know, generations of research, of which Sandy was a seminal contributor to, that out-of-school factors are by far the most predictive factor in terms of school performance. So it would be nice if we could move to a more constructive conversation where we just sort of thought more functionally about a particular kid, the kid coming to school hungry, what sort of food do they need in the morning? Once they get there, what sort of activities do they need that would stimulate, if you fix things out of school and then people went to schools that, and people went to schools that didn't build on that, that work, that would be sort of equally problematic. The summer learning loss literature on this is really interesting. It sort of suggests that the trajectories of poor and middle and upper class kids are actually fairly similar during the years, but that more advantaged kids either stay flat or tend to move ahead in the summer, and that less advantaged kids lose a lot when they're out of school. I have a colleague at Ohio State, Doug Downey, who's made an argument sort of building on that summer slide literature to argue that schools are actually more equalizing institutions than we realize, that the ways in which kids spend time in schools, even if to our naked eye, a school in Newton looks a lot better than a school in somewhere else, that just the way that kids are spending the school day is actually much more closely similar to the way in which, at least cognitively, they're spending their out-of-school time. So maybe that wheel will come around again and we'll start to see schools more as equalizers.
I think Giles' right that schools are equalizing institutions, but we've raised the ante. We used to think if you made it more equal than the homes, that was enough. And now we think it's got to be perfectly equal, and that's really hard. And I don't know how you get from here to there on that question, politically or actually.
So we're just one factoid to add to what Jala was saying. In typical urban school districts, a third of the kids come to school with untreated dental problems. We lose 1.5 million days a year. As kids, we're not talking about the odd little cavity. We're talking about something much more serious. A third of the kids come to school with untreated vision problems. And about a third of the kids come to school with untreated asthma. So if you can't see the board, if you're in pain, you're having a hard time breathing, it just seems pretty straightforward that, and you're hungry, add that to the mix, that schools have an enormously uphill battle. And it's astonishing that that gets ignored in the conversation. By the way, the people who talk about no excuses, Michelle Rhee, Joel Klein, actually on the QT were big on community schools. They just wouldn't allow that to enter into their conversation because it would muddy the message.
All right.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. So I was at a talk this morning, and I heard two numbers, and I've also heard a number that 86% of statistics are not to be believed, but I heard that 75% of people who go to medical school, and this was a talk at Harvard Medical School, are from families that make upwards of $250,000. And I also heard that 49% of the 1% are physicians, which was kind of a big surprise for me. But for me, I didn't walk away with the message that it was the money that mattered. For me, the message was that it was the acts, having that money and growing up in that home would make all the difference. The big difference would be access to resources. And in this talk, what I was so struck by was there was the quotation about this piece with Condoleezza Rice and how there was a lot of marketplace discussions about how the economy would get ahead and things like that being mentioned by others in different pieces. There was also the academic discussion and case study-based discussion. But I was really struck by, which you did bring it up in the very end, is at the very basic level, I'm here today. I came here 15 years ago to this country. But the only reason I'm here today is because of my education and what my parents did in terms of my education. So I'm struck by the lack of an urgency, a visceral response of why this is not a social justice issue. Why isn't it, and you did discuss that in the last minute, why isn't there an urgency? This is a social justice. Education is in some way a leveler. It does help people like President Obama get past certain hurdles of race and other issues. So why isn't there an urgency, and what are your thoughts on that? Has anybody measured in these schools if other socioeconomic, criminal justice type factors have improved in those situations, in those towns and counties where good examples of education exist.
So I think we'd all agree that it's a social justice issue. If you look at the studies, and I'm going to give you approximate statistics, of the top 160 most selective colleges and universities in this country, that's a pretty large swath. 75% of the students come from the top 25% of the income bracket. 3% come from the bottom 25% of the income bracket. That exaggerates the number of kids from the bottom income bracket because they are classically in the least selective of those schools. So at the higher education level, you have this more than this, you have this amplification of inequality. But there's interesting work done by Carolyn Hawksby, very simple sort of work about getting information material out to kids, getting support to poor kids who never even think about applying to first-line schools because they think they can't afford it, and how it is that you change that trajectory. But you're asking an important part of a broader question. Social justice is not a phrase that has a lot of political resonance now. The left in this conversation is going to talk about return on investment. I mean, right? So the most commonly heard argument for preschool is that there's a 7-to-1 return on investment. That's a very, interesting way to describe this. And that includes, when people talk about this, substantial reductions in costs of incarceration. Well, you could say, my God, look at all those kids for whom the arc of their lives has been transformed by that experience. But that isn't the language we have. This is really part of the, you pardon the expression, the vision thing, as George Bush first used to call it. And it's, my only hope, and I hope somebody's going to do better than this, is that we're all Whigs in terms of our thinking about the world. Those of us who are positive Whigs think that things are going to be a little better. Those of us who are sort of skeptical Whigs think things are going to be a little worse. And the one thing we know about 10 years down the road is that we're not going to be very good at predicting what life is like 10 years down the road. What we can do to steer that ship, Sandy and Jal will tell you.
I think the rise and fall of interest in social justice in the United States has always been one of those things that you went like this. In fact, when I was, I was a sophomore at Harvard College. I won't tell you how many years ago. And my professor put a wiggly line on the blackboard to describe this. And I was sitting in the back of a room which went down like this, and I looked down and I saw all these hands going like this, putting the wiggly line into their notebooks. And I thought, well, I wonder how many people now remember putting that wiggly line into their notebooks. But we have only episodic commitment to reform in the United States, and that's partly because we think we're perfect, so that why would we need to reform? But that's obviously untrue, and we're in denial and all those things we could say. But when you're in the down trough, waiting for it to go up again, you never know when that's going to happen. I grew up in the 1950s, and I had not the slightest premonition that the 60s were coming, and nor, as far as I can tell, did anybody else.
I see people lined up, so just very briefly. I mean, I think it actually has been interesting over the last, say, 20 years or so, that there are a lot of people, particularly young people, who see education as a social justice issue. It's just the bounds with which it's considered a social justice issue kind of excludes things like desegregating schools, for example, which would have been sort of prominent on the agenda the last time this was a social justice issue. So I think among a much larger group of people than you would have suspected, there is a social justice urgency. And then ironically, to the point that David made before, there are times where that actually contributes to the problem to some degree because people want things to improve overnight, and they're not going to improve overnight. It will require a kind of steady persistence. But I think the real question from sort of social justice is, could it be expanded, and could the agenda be expanded and linked beyond just like, will these schools close test score gaps, to kind of, can we build vibrant communities of which schools are a central part? And I don't see that many people signing up for that second agenda.
Thank you.
You know, unfortunately, it's already 7 o'clock, so let's do this. We'll take one more question, and then those who have questions can come up and ask the panelists on their own.
Okay, so my question is pretty simple. I'm a 4th grade teacher in Boston. Arnie Duncan was at our school yesterday. I'm a parent of 2 students in the Cambridge Public Schools. And my question simply is, what do we do? How do we move this from this nice setting, and we're you know, all of these problems that we've described, we know we have these problems. I guess what I'm wondering is, do you see one major catalyst for change? Do you see it happening with the parents who just all of a sudden it dawns on them that this is, you know, the schools are going in, schools here in Cambridge that have been built around communities, those communities have been taken down. So a lot of us feel like we're going in the wrong direction. Is our parents going to be the catalyst? Are teachers, our teacher education programs, are we waiting for administrators and the Department of Ed to have a divine, you know, sort of enlightenment? This is not, obviously, you're not going to be able to answer this question in any sort of simple form, but I am curious from, you know, people who write books and talk about education policy, where is the manifestation of all of that in our everyday lives, those of us who are sort of steeped in it on a daily basis? And I agree with all of the, you know, the old school strategies working, and I have very few allies at my school who agree with that. It's sort of like, where is the tide going to turn? Are we waiting? Is it going to be like 20, 25 years?
You know, again, were we in France, right? The answer is we would decree a different world, and lo and behold, it might come to pass. But we're not, and some of us think that's too bad, and many of us think that's a good thing. So to me, the answer is all the above. That it's going to happen in different ways, in different communities. There are going to be catalysts from all of the groups that you describe. A group of teachers get together in a school. Some parents organize around something. You know, a school board gets it in terms of what it is that they need. Other community groups, you know, come to the schools and say, we need you to do a different kind of, you know, provide a different kind of education for your kids. And the closer, you know, the closer you get to the kid, the more intimate and effective the change, but the more limited the change. I think people have said to me, so what are the prospects for change at the national or state level? And I hear national and I sort of cry a little bit, and then I hear state level and I brighten some, because interesting things are happening in some states. But I think, to me, the likeliest unit of change is school districts, and there are lots of different ways into that, whether it's school board elections, whether it's parent engagement, whether it's bringing in the advent of an administrator or administrators who get what it is that's going on. A week ago, I sat on a platform with Carmen Farina, who's the new chancellor of schools in New York. And by the way, this is another thing that I'll get thrown out of here for. I love being in Harvard, but I'm much happier really being out with people who are in the field doing the work and not talking about doing the work. Because it's just because more is going to happen as a result of that conversation. You hope otherwise, but there's a lot of data that would suggest that that's a concern. And you listen, and so I was asked the question, what do I think about the future for New York City schools? And I said, I've always thought that New York, Chicago, LA were districts that were too big to succeed. It's produced a gasp in an audience of New Yorkers who never want to hear such things. But it turns out that Carmen Farina had written a book. And I was told when I was going to be there that Carmen Farina had written a book, and I thought, okay, I should read this. And it is not an inspiring book, but it's a really good book. It has more to say about leadership at the on-the-ground level of how, what does a form of evaluation of teachers look like that isn't the gotcha form, or I'm coming in 3 weeks so the teacher knows how to prepare a lesson. It's fabulous stuff, and it's down to here's what the memo should look like, here's how a meeting should be organized, here's how you engage in parents so that you don't let them run the school, but you make sure that they feel like part of the school. And I thought, this is a book that probably sold 8 copies, because it's published by an obscure press in New Hampshire, and it's not written in a particularly engaging manner. But I would say that for certainly anybody who's in the world of education leadership, and that includes people who are thinking about, that includes people who are teachers who care, whose vision extends beyond their own classroom, it's a great thing to read. It's very practical, very nuts and boltsy. So that's a windy and complicated, it depends answer, but I think that's the way American education is, and it's depends world.
Sandy?
I would just add one thing, which is if you take seriously the proposition that 3 years is too short to change a system, you need to be very leery of people whose stake in answering the question is short. And that usually includes, A, parents, because their kids are in one school and they want to fix that school, but by the time they begin to get ready, they get to the point where they know enough parents to actually do something about it, their kids are already almost ready to go out the door, and they're, And it also is a problem for school boards. In fact, I think it's a problem, such a serious problem for school boards, that I'm very ambivalent about the existence of school boards as a form of governance. And that leads to a much more general question, which is, I don't know of any other country that runs a successful school system that tries to govern its schools the way we do. They do sort of sometimes, but it's usually different. And I think we need to think more seriously about that than we have. But certainly having 3 levels of government, or 4 if you count the individual schools, or 5 if you go down to the level of the classroom, or whatever, is really hard to make anything work out right with something that complicated.
Okay, thank you very much.
John, you want to have the last word, or you?
I agree with everything that Sandy and David said. I might just say, to you as a 4th grade teacher, I feel like there are sort of 2 avenues. One is kind of organizing within your school, and the other is speaking to the policy environment. And so I'm sure you know a lot more than I do about what it would mean, or whether it was possible to speak within your school. But I do think that I agree with David, there are sort of 1,000 things that need to happen, but I think one really salient thing is teachers, particularly good teachers, need to speak in policy discussions. I've just been in zillions of meetings where there are no teachers and people are proposing all sorts of nonsensical things without any realization that those things will not actually work in any kind of real context. And other organizations like Teach Plus and others that create opportunities for teachers to speak to policy, and I think we need a lot more of that.
Right. Listen, thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to David, Jal, and Sandy.